Well, thanks so much for having me, everybody. I really enjoyed that brief welcome. It reminded me a little bit when we did the Learning at Scale conference online earlier this year. We had one MC, and the MC was Renee Kizelchak, who's from Germany now at Cornell, who became the kind of designated clapper. He kept his microphone on, and after every presentation or panel presentation, he would just do a nice little gentle clap, and it was sort of the only sound that acknowledged the end of a talk. I thought that was kind of a nice. I like the way that we're discovering sort of new kinds of routines that make what we're doing work a little bit better than it had been working starting in March. So I have a new book out, Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education, failuretodisrupt.com. Just this past few months, we've done a really fun online book club and where we discussed one chapter a week with a bunch of folks. The recordings are starting to be released now at teachlabpodcast.com. The way my screen is set up, I can't see the chat very well, but people should feel free to ask questions or turn your microphone on and interrupt. And Marcus, you can QB that. I can either just keep talking for another few minutes and then have some time for questions at the end, but people should feel free to interrupt. So part of what inspired Failure to Disrupt was the recognition that over the last 2 decades, education technology evangelists have made a remarkable series of claims about the power of education technology to transform teaching and learning. Clay Christensen, the late Harvard Business School professor, in 2009 wrote a book, Disrupting Class, where he said 50% of all grades 6 through 12 courses would be online by 2019, that they would cost as third as much, and they would have better learning outcomes. In the heady years of MOOC mania, Sebastian Thrun, the founder of Udacity, said that in 50 years, there'll be only 10 institutions in the world delivering higher education, and Udacity has a shot of being one of them. Sal Khan did a couple of TED Talks in 2011 and 2013, where he said, let's use video to reinvent education. Instead of, let's have children learn math by sitting in front of terminals, getting an algorithmically optimized, personalized, tutoring experience from the computer, and then periodically teachers would come along and pull these people together to do projects or enrichment. But ultimately, let's use computers to individualize math instruction. And then Sugata Mitra, who won the 2013 TED Prize, he gave the keynote talk at the Learning at Scale conference in 2016. In some sense, he went further than all these folks and said, actually, all these school institutions aren't even necessary. All we need to do is have groups of children have access to the internet and through laptops, and then they can just learn anything by themselves. So these predictions forecast human society being on the cusp of a dramatic transformation of education systems through technology. In some ways, they argued that the contemporary education system was, its days were numbered. And then one day soon, a new technology-mediated education system was come along, and it would really be better than the existing contemporary system. So then starting in January last year, a global pandemic blighted the world. Maybe as many as 1.6 billion learners had their educations interrupted. All of a sudden the calculus of these new technologies changed somewhat. Instead of having to be better than the existing well-developed funded education system, they really only had to be better than a broken, hobbled, pandemic-inflected system. My hunch is that some of you are parents and you have kids at home right now. And my guess is that you have not concluded that groups of children with laptops connected to the internet can teach themselves anything they want to. Nor, I would say, have the other dramatic predictions come true even during COVID time. I haven't talked with that many audiences in the Netherlands yet, but I've talked with folks all throughout the United States and in lots of places in the world. And I have yet to hear, substantial stories of dramatically new education technologies coming to the fore during this period of crisis. Very few places taking advantage of massive open online courses or artificial intelligence or data science or augmented reality or learning analytics. These technologies supposedly sort of on the cusp of transforming our systems have not come to the fore during the pandemic. Instead, I would argue that there's really two technologies that have been the most fundamental, essential, widely used technologies during the pandemic. And they're two of our very oldest technologies. The first are learning management systems, which are theorized in the 1960s and 1970s. They were commercialized in the 1990s, made open source in the 2000s. These are things like Canvas and Google Classroom and Schoology. And it's a tool for letting educators and learners pass documents back and forth. It has some other functions about scheduling and some forums and things like that. But the main thing it does is it lets people pass documents back and forth. And then, the most distinctive technology of the pandemic is the one that we're using right now. In the United States, when it was introduced in the 1930s, we called it video telephony. It's more known as video conferencing right now. But the thing that you can do with these two technologies is you can replicate as closely as possible the conventional routines of a face-to-face classroom at a distance. One of the ways to describe what's happened particularly in secondary education and higher education all across the world is that faculty walked away from their lecterns and they sat down in front of their home office webcams and they kept teaching roughly as well as they, in the same kind of manner as they could before the advent of the pandemic. Primary education has been a little bit different because our youngest learners, 6 and 7 and 8 years old, can't really manipulate these two technologies very well. And so teachers have more or less tried to use this combination. And if you have a full-time parent or caregiver at home, it works okay. And if you don't, it's kind of a disaster. But that I would say is, there's lots of local variation. There's all kinds of different things happening in different places. But for the most part, as far as I can tell, this is sort of the primary story of the pandemic, a moment in which you might think new emerging technologies would come along to sweep away and to rescue a broken system. And instead, I would say that we will never in our lifetimes see a more powerful demonstration of the conservatism of educational systems than what we've witnessed over the last 9 or 10 months with this this pivot of a system to try to use technology to replicate as many of its existing features as were possible. So if you're a center for education and learning, or you're affiliated with a center for education and learning, and you want to use technology to try to make people's learning lives better, I think it behooves all of us who work in education technology to sit with this for a little bit, is to try to ask ourselves the questions, what can we learn about these patterns of activity during the pandemic that would help those of us who try to use new and emerging technologies to improve teaching and learning? What are the lessons that we can learn here? Here are two lessons that are my starting point for just about all of the analysis that I do of education technology. I think they've been proven time and time again over the last 30 years, and I think they've been reinforced too during the pandemic. These are two very safe starting points. When teachers get access to new technologies, they use them to extend existing systems. The the primary intuition of teachers with access to new technologies is to digitize the kinds of practices they were doing before. And that's not because teachers are lazy. It's not because teachers aren't incredibly smart and talented. The amount of work that we've seen from faculty members in primary, secondary, tertiary education, it's just been absolutely extraordinary and inspiring. But it takes a long time for teachers to get new technologies and to figure out how to use them in new and different kinds of ways. Actually, the little clapping routine that we did at the beginning of this session is a great example of that. Marcus facilitated a routine that built a sense of personal connection amongst us at great remove as we try to, teach and learn with each other through the keyhole of Zoom. It's one little technique that starts making things feel a little bit more authentic, a little bit more communicative, more powerful. And I'm sure very few conferences of this size are using this technique because it's new. And it takes time for those sorts of practices to spread throughout systems. My sense is that actually remote teaching and learning is getting better. And it's not getting better because people are adopting some kind of sweeping new framework or new pedagogical approach. It's because educators and learners are finding 1,000 little techniques like that sand down the rough edges of learning and make them a little bit better. Where there is beneficial and innovative new practice with technology, it will disproportionately benefit the affluent. This is something that we've seen, in my own work studying massive open online courses. This is something that we found repeatedly in different studies, that it was not that MOOCs democratized education, is that they helped people who already had a master's degree get another certificate or get a second master's degree. And during the pandemic, we've seen that inequalities in education are both revealed and expanded. Now, I think there are some folks who have been part of this wave of education technology evangelism over the last 20 years that have started to reflect on these kinds of challenges. One of those folks is Sal Khan. Millions of people have watched Sal Khan's 2 TED Talks. I think far fewer have read his 2019 interview with District Administration magazine, which is this little trade magazine for superintendent for district leaders in the United States. And he was being interviewed. One of the things that Khan did in between founding Khan Academy and now is that he started a school called the Khan Academy Lab School. It's a private school out in Silicon Valley. And he said in this interview, now that I run a school, I see that some of this stuff is not as easy to accomplish compared to how it sounds theoretically. It's taken me and the Khan Academy longer to realize this, but not everyone can easily move to a mastery-based, self-paced learning environment. That's hard to do overnight. And so his suggestions then are to have students do regular teaching 4 days a week, and then spend about 1 class period a week doing practice problems on Khan Academy. And he says that's the best of both worlds because it's both doable and it seems to lead to some improvements in outcomes. When I read that, it struck me as very familiar because it's the same model that Ken Kadinger implemented in the early 1990s. Ken Kadinger developed a bunch of math tutors, cognitive tutors, went into the Pittsburgh public schools. He tried to get folks to use them to teach in a regular way 3 days a week and do the practice problems with the computers 2 days a week. And the teachers wouldn't do that, but they would do 1 day a week. And he got results that were about the same as what Sal Khan came up with 25 years later. One of the ways that you could tell this story is that after $150 million of philanthropic investment, Sal Khan learned something about education technology in mathematics in school classrooms that we could have figured out with a trip to the library. So with these kinds of, I've tried to feature 2 important parts of the education system, a kind of conservatism that's embedded in it, and a kind of sense of history that are, brand new technologies are often not as transformative as we hope. At their best, they kind of build incrementally on what we've learned in the past. A big part of what I'm trying to do in failure to disrupt is to celebrate that incrementalism. One of the tools that I use in the book is a pair of stances that come from a lovely book by Morgan Ames called The Charisma Machine, a story of the One Laptop per Child program out of MIT. And Morgan Ames defines two stances that I find quite helpful in analyzing how people think about technology in the future. One stance is the charismatic stance. The charismatic stance predicts that technology will disrupt and transform education systems, that the future will be brand new and different because of new technology. This is the kind of stance that 2011 Sal Khan was talking about in his YouTube TED Talks. If you were a charismatic technologist at the beginning of the pandemic, you would host conferences that were called things like the dawn of the digital age or reinventing higher education. You'd predict that during this period of change and instability and a weakening traditional education system, that this would really be the moment that new technologies would lead to widespread transformation. And then a second stance, I think, is the one that sounds more like Sal Khan in the district administration interview. And Morgan Ames calls it the tinkering stance. And she borrows from David Tyack and Larry Cuban's book, Tinkering Towards Utopia. And a core prediction of the tinkering stance is that existing systems domesticate new technologies. They don't get swept away by new technologies. They take new technologies and they integrate them into the existing system. If you want to predict the future of educational systems, then you see the future as an extension of trends from history rather than a disjunctive break from the past. Tinkerers can make education systems better. We can take a kind of shoulder to the wheel approach and we can say, well, you know, education systems are empirically conservative. Maybe we think that's a good thing. Maybe we think that's not a good thing, but it's not a good idea to bet on disruptive transformations. Instead, the way to think about the future is to think that if we want teaching and learning to be better, it's going to happen one incremental change over time. And if we're lucky, we'll get to look back after 10 or 20 or 25 years and go, oh, you know, that's a pretty dramatic accumulation of incremental changes, but not these huge disruptive shifts. If there's something that I'm trying to do in the book, it's to celebrate this kind of tinkering stance. I would say that there are two particular errors of thinking that charismatic technologists have made during the pandemic, or maybe it's that the pandemic has revealed two particular kinds of errors of charismatics. One is, if you want to predict a disruptive, rapidly transformed future, you have to describe your technologies as powerful as sweeping. But learning technologies, for the most part, they're not all purpose. They serve some students, but not others, in some subjects, but not others, in some contexts, but not others. They're better understood as like distinctly shaped pegs in a landscape of differently shaped holes. We happen to have some things that look like adaptive tutors, gamified adaptive tutors, that work reasonably well in K-5 mathematics. Kindergarten through 5th grade mathematics. That's a good thing because it's almost impossible to teach a second grader very much about mathematics through Zoom conferencing with a kid sitting by themselves, you know, in their bedroom or in their kitchen trying to follow along through an iPad or a Chromebook. The tools we have like ST Math, Dreambox are pretty good complements to that. We don't have good K-5 adaptive tutors for teaching reading. We don't have them for teaching social studies or science or how to tie your shoes or how to make a friend or the dozens and dozens of other things that we try to teach people in primary school. We have, you know, and so the gamified adaptive math tutors we have, they're pretty good, but they solve one little problem in a sea of many, many problems. The second category error that I think technologists have made is in convincing folks that learning technologies are like a switch that you just flip on and off, that if you just download these new tools, you'll see dramatic changes in teaching and learning. But our learning technologies are only as effective as the communities that provide support to them. One way to say this is that every technology solution is a human capital problem. Every time we want to make teaching and learning better through technology, there are many educators, many families and caregivers, many students that have to get better at using these tools. And that is a time-consuming developmental process that requires investment, that requires professional learning. We can make teaching and learning better with technology, but it's often not solely, the benefits are not solely embedded in the technologies. They have to be embedded in the pedagogical sense, in the pedagogical wisdom of the communities that guide their use. That's probably the main thing that I wanted to say about kind of the introduction of the stances of the book and how it applies to the pandemic. Now, I'll give you a little tour of what's in the rest of the book. In the first half, one of the things that I argue is that the technologies that tech evangelists are most enthusiastic about, I call them, and many others do, technologies for learning at scale, learning environments with many learners and few experts to guide them. And to try to generate enthusiasm and excitement, evangelists often describe their tools as brand new, as never seen before, as transformative. But in fact, most technologies are not particularly new. Most technologies emerge from a long lineage of technologies. We've been working on learning technologies for as long as we've had computers. And Audrey Waters has a wonderful book coming out called Teaching Machines, which explores the pre-digital efforts at mechanical teaching machines. This is an old human endeavor to have computer scientists partner with learning designers and instructional designers. And so one of the ways that we can predict the future is by looking at the past. I argue that there are actually three main kinds of learning at scale technologies that can be defined by the answer to the question, who guides the sequence of learning activities? There are instructor-guided learning at scale, like massive open online courses. There's algorithm-guided learning at scale, like adaptive tutors. There's peer-guided learning at scale, network learning communities, like the original Connectivist MOOCs, or like the Scratch programming community in language. And each of these genres has a set of technologies they use, has a set of pedagogies they favor. They have a research literature, which gives us some sense of the outcomes that we can expect from these tools. And so when new technologies emerge, we can look at them and instead of saying, how is this brand new thing going to transform education? We can say, what is this like? And what kinds of effects has this kind of technology had in the past? And I think if we start with that question of what's really new here, we're likely to do better evaluation of how new technologies can shape the future of teaching and learning. In the second half of the book, I wrestle with four dilemmas that I think cut across these three genres. One of the things about the three learning at scale genres is they actually tend to be studied by different communities. So people who study MOOCs go to eMOOCs or go to the Learning at Scale conference. People who study adaptive tutors go to AI and Ed, or they go to the Education Data Mining Conference. People who study peer-guided learning at networks go to the Connected Learning Summit or the Constructionism Conference. And there's something that's normal and natural about that. But actually, though all forms of learning at scale tend to run into many of the same kinds of problems, I think there's something to be said for trying to analyze across these domains. And so I propose in the second half of the book, 4 kinds of challenges that come up over and over again as people try to build and implement education technologies. The curse of the familiar is the idea that we can build technologies that replicate existing routines in schools and they can get widely adopted. But when we do digitize existing routines and get wide adoption, they tend not to change teaching and learning very much. By contrast, when we build technologies that try to create really new, really different kinds of routines in classrooms. As Sal Khan discovered, those systems tend to reject those more aggressive kinds of changes. So you can either have widespread implementation of little changes, or you can have niche implementation of big changes. And that's a dilemma that education technologies wrestle with. A second is the EdTech Matthew effect that I referred to before, that typically new technologies disproportionately benefit the affluent, despite our descriptions of them as trying to democratize education. And there are some well-worn, well-understood patterns about how new technologies disproportionately benefit the affluent. And there are smaller numbers of interesting studies, interesting implementations out there that suggest some ways that we might do better than we have in the past. The trap of routine assessment is that many of our learning at scale systems require automated assessments to provide meaningful learning experiences for individuals. And we just don't have that many domains that we're good at assessing. We're good at assessing people's mathematics computation. We're good at some things in early language around word recognition. We have some cool new tools about pronunciation detection. We have some pretty good tools for evaluating computer programs. One of the things that we're not good at is evaluating natural language, whether oral or written. We're not very good at evaluating reasoning from evidence. And that's too bad, because actually the main thing that we teach from kindergarten through graduate school in our education systems is the ability to reason from evidence. Moreover, the things that we're good at assessing, they tend to be the kinds of things that computers are already good at doing. We're good at assessing the routine kinds of parts of tasks of cognitive work that are most easy to digitize. So in a sense, our automated assessment systems are best at evaluating things that we don't need people to do anymore. That's a dilemma that requires innovation. And then finally, I write about the toxic power of data and experiment, where I suggest that a really cool thing about our online learning tools is that we can use the data that they capture. We can use the ability to conduct lots and lots of experiments in them to do some really cool educational research. But it turns out that people don't like their children being submitted to educational experiments. The phrase experimenting on your children is one that researchers like, but parents like much less. And we can collect reams and reams of data around people, and we can maybe learn some interesting things about education technology. But in doing so, we also inculcate people into a culture of surveillance, which is probably not something that we want to be teaching, whether education technologies. So there's much more to be said about all four of these dilemmas, but the idea is, regardless of what kind of education technology you're trying to build, you're trying to implement, these are the kinds of challenges that show up over and over again. If you're a developer, these are the kinds of hurdles to making a bigger impact with your tools. If you're a researcher, I hope that these are some lines of thinking and challenges that you'd find interesting to be able to experiment with and explore. So if you're a center for education and learning, if you're a center of technology innovation, how might you balance, an enthusiasm for using technology to try to improve teaching and learning, with the recognition that the charismatic stance, talk of disruption, talk of transformative change, historically, it has not panned out very successfully, and I think the pandemic is a profound example of the limits of our ability to improve teaching and learning with technology. And I would give three pieces of advice for folks trying to do this work. And the first is to embrace tinkering. When we embrace charismatic stances, we generate hype cycles that create distrust between education technology advocates and the broader public that uses education technology. But when we build and study tools that improve human welfare with a shoulder to the wheel, incremental kinds of ways, I think we can stay close to science and to reality while continuously making things better. If you're hoping for a brand new future, that's probably a disappointment. If you think human development is just a long, slow process of improvement, then maybe that's okay. I hope the 4 dilemmas that I introduced briefly whet your appetite to explore them more. It's pretty well understood, I would say at this point, what some of the hurdles are to making more powerful education technology. And the more we can attend to these kinds of repeated hurdles, the better chance we have of building things that are more useful for teachers and learners. And then finally, technology is not going to, in and of itself, dramatically improve teaching and learning. What's going to improve teaching and learning is strengthening our educational systems. Technology can play one role in that, but organizing plays a role in that. Politics plays a role in that. Funding plays a role in that. Our education technologies will only be as powerful as the communities of educators that use them. Technologies can play a powerful role in catalyzing conversations about strengthening systems, but they don't do the work of strengthening systems themselves. So I hope those are some ideas that spark your thinking, that reflect some of the things that you've been talking about today and we'll talk about for the rest of the afternoon. And I see some notes have popped up in the chat, but I haven't had a chance to read them as going along. I'd welcome any thoughts or questions.
Great, thanks a lot, Justin. I followed a bit the chat. So one question that was discussed here, one question from Wilfried Rubens came up about how to see the difference between other industries and education, as he writes, I mean, disruption and transformation, looking at tourism or music or other domains.
Right, I think that's an important point. That, over the last 20 years, there have been sectors of our economy, parts of our society, that technology has really transformed. Journalism is quite different. The word friend means something different than it did, 25 years ago. There are sectors of our economy that do get transformed by new technologies, and education doesn't seem to be one of them. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the education sector is one that we ask its practitioners to raise our children. And most people bring a fairly conservative approach to raising young people. That's kind of, I would think, a normal thing to expect in a society. Most people don't want radical disruptive innovation happening in their children's classrooms. But the second, maybe 2 other related issues are the education system tries to balance this incredible list of competing needs and interests. We ask the education system to teach people to tie their shoes, to learn to speak Mandarin, to conjugate verbs, to understand the movement of continents through plate tectonics, to understand the origins of human civilization in Mesopotamia, to have patriotic, loyal values towards one country, to critique one's country, to not have sex, but if you do have sex, to do it in certain ways, to make friends. There's just this incredible list of things that we ask education systems to do, and they're in conflict with one another, they're in tension with one another. And so every school system manages to balance this incredible network of tensions. A bunch of these tensions don't even have anything to do with teaching and learning. One of the things that we learned during the pandemic, or we relearned during the pandemic, is that we use schools to keep children busy during the day so their families can work. We use schools as a place to have children be fed, to have a safe place to go during the day. This tightly webbed networked system, when people try to change one part of it, they find that they screw up a bunch of delicate balances in other parts of the system. And that, I think, that sort of like delicate network of interests is part of what generates this conservatism in education systems. So I think, I mean, when I was studying the use of social media in education in the 2000s, there was this rhetoric, well, social media has transformed all these sectors, isn't going to transform education. Studying MOOCs in the last decade, online tools have transformed so many sectors, isn't going to transform education. And I think we'll see continuous change, but I think we now have, enough digital hype cycles underneath our belt that we would be unwise to continue with the presumption that education is like other sectors, on a path towards short-term dramatic change. I think there's a lot more evidence to look at, and the pandemic is an incredible example of this, of seeing education systems as conservative systems.
Okay, great. I have two more questions. Fashida first, please.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Justin, for your elaborate comments. And also, I have your book. I'm really looking forward to read it.
Great, thank you.
I have a question in regards to the educational paradigm where we're currently in. So there's been some research that suggests that we're in a third educational paradigm where we're moving away from the idea of teachers being the sole purveyors of knowledge and being in charge of creating this pre-recorded set of skills and knowledge to transfer to students. And some researchers have been, how to say this nicely, I'm looking for the word, have been lobbying for a system where teaching is done more autonomous and learning is done more autonomous and students have more autonomy of their learning, and slowly making this shift towards a third educational paradigm where these different actors who are in charge of transferring knowledge come together. And one of their biggest claims is that the society is highly multidimensional and networked. And so education needs to do the same. And the way I feel about this is the same way I feel about edtech evangelists like myself, making the claim that now we need to abandon all edtech and move towards more challenge-based, problem-based, design-based education, because this is what the world requires. And I'd love to see, or I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think education systems should be engaged in the process of continuous improvement. I think there are good reasons to think that our education systems are disproportionately balanced. Plutarch said something to the effect of, translated poetically, education is not the filling of a pail, but the kindling of a flame. So the dilemma that you're describing, Plutarch would have recognized 2,000 years ago. Should we spend a bunch of time telling people what they need to know, or should we let them explore and figure things out on their own? And my sense is that education systems, over that 2,000-year period, have been sort of overly balanced towards telling people what to do rather than exploring it for themselves. I would say where I teach at MIT, we work on that dilemma fairly regularly. One of the things that's happening across our curriculum is trying to make more space, particularly earlier on in the MIT experience, for more hands-on exploratory learning. I think it used to be like in mechanical engineering, you'd spend 3 years sitting in lecture classes, and then your senior year, someone would say, okay, you've learned enough, now you can try to build a robot. What we're doing more now is having people show up as freshmen and saying, hey, let's go try to build a robot. And they do a terrible job because we haven't taught them a bunch of stuff that they need to build a good robot. But a kid builds a lousy robot and you go put your arm around their shoulder and say, hey, you know why your robot's lousy? It's because you haven't learned control systems yet. Why don't you go take this lecture series on control systems and then you'll build a better robot. So we're still building a robot and we're still doing lectures on control systems. We're just reevaluating the way that we organize and to some extent balance that time so that there's a little bit more building stuff and a little bit less lecturing on stuff. But these are sort of well-worn dilemmas. I think, to folks who are working to bring these kinds of new ideas to life, I think it's a great thing to work on. I think if you're sort of trying to do that in a really empirically rigorous way, one of the things that you would have to pay attention to is that when our entire education system, because of a pandemic, stopped working, we did not default. We could have used this as an opportunity to build new systems that say, oh, let's, for goodness sakes, let's not try to reproduce school through the keyhole of Zoom classrooms. Let's come up with something better for students to do that makes sense for them to do at home and in their own local contexts. But virtually none of that happened. What we said was, let's replicate as best we could what already existed. And so I think, whatever your politics are, and countering that conservatism head on is, I think, an important part of trying to build whatever future you're imagining.
Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. I have one more, Jillian.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for an inspirational talk. Making both MOOCs and being a normal face-to-face teacher, I found it, to a certain extent, amusing to see my colleagues switch and sometimes just sheer panic when I'm like, all that time you said I was wasting on my MOOCs. But what I also see is you said something that I think is part of the problem in disruption is you said if you are into EdTech, you go to this conference. If you go to Learning Languages, you go to that conference. And I think that is probably one of the things that I think we should all do better on, is that we should stop preaching for our own parishes, so to speak. And you see that now. I know that I probably shouldn't have, but when my colleagues at the engineering education world said, oh, our next conference is going to be about the influence of online learning, I was like, yeah, well, that's been done. Yeah, but it was really special this year. No, it wasn't. But then I realized for them it was really, really special. And I think if all those evangelists, I love that word, were to go out and talk to the people that still need to be converted rather than preaching to the converted, I think we should have far more, in line with the theme of Renate's talk, also have interdisciplinary conferences where we share each other's experiences.
One thing that I've reflected on over the last, much more so over the last few years, is just how incredibly granular the work of teaching and learning is. There are colleagues in your engineering school who what they're trying to teach is totally different from colleagues in other places, and what they do day to day is quite different. I mean, this is especially dramatic, I think, in primary, secondary schools.
Yes.
Where someone's teaching a kid to tie their shoes, and someone else is teaching a kid to conjugate Mandarin verbs, and someone else is teaching a kid plate tectonics. But I do think to some extent, it is the case that when we have new education innovations, communities of practitioners do in fact need to discover them for themselves. And we might say, oh, that's super frustrating. We already figured these things out. But I think there's good evidence, for instance, that when physics educators discover something about teaching and learning, the chemistry educators don't automatically pick it up. The chemistry educators need to kind of discover it for themselves, embrace it for themselves. And you would say, oh, that's super inefficient. That means we need to go like department by department to get people to adopt good new ideas like active learning or whatever else it might be. And that's really frustrating. But on the other hand, that seems to be reality. And so when we encounter those kinds of realities and truths, which I think is built into this kind of conservatism of education system, then we need to say, okay, so we're not going to publish the one universal book that gets people to adopt online learning practices or active learning practices. We're going to actually have to write one for literature and for engineering and for geometry and for everything else. And so okay, that's okay. Let's get started. To me, I think and again, I think for an organization like the Center for Education and Learning, that's probably important wisdom there, that they do need to, one of the things that I love about LDE Center for Education and Learning is the way that you bring together people from different disciplines, psychologists, online learning folks, the strengths of all three of your universities and the partners that you bring in. And there need to be these kinds of interdisciplinary hubs, and these interdisciplinary hubs probably then need to feed out and say like, okay, computer scientists, like, what are you excited about? What do you want to learn? How do we help you in your own discipline take these ideas and use them to improve?
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Justin. So let's do the exercise from the beginning again. Please unmute your mics and give a big round of applause. Good be on the recording, Justin. Thank you very much for being with us, and hope to speak to you and meet you in person soon again.